Hey everyone, welcome back to the Phoenix's Tale. I am your host Gabe, and this week we are going to be talking about Chapter 9, Grim Defeat. So, our recap real quick. You notice our recaps are getting a little longer. I think I mentioned that at the beginning in Chapter 1 that things are going to start shifting because there's a bit more detail in each chapter, and there are a few more chapters in this book than we saw in Chamber of Secrets and Sorcerer's Stone. So this is why my recaps have been a little bit longer, because there's a bit more detail that we need to talk about. Anyway, so we open the chapter. The entire school returns to the Great Hall for the night while the staff search the castle for Sirius Black after his failed attempt to gain entry to Gryffindor Tower. During the night, Professors Dumbledore and Snape, along with Percy Weasley, the head boy, discuss Black's escape. Harry, Ron, and Hermione pretending to be asleep because Dumbledore, Snape, and Percy are standing very close to them. They hear Snape talking in code to exclude Percy from the conversation. Mentions the fact that Black could not have gotten into the castle without help on the inside, to which Dumbledore tells him that he doesn't believe a single person would have helped Black enter the castle. Sir Cadogan, who we meet as Harry, Ron, and Hermione are finding their way to Professor Trelawney's classroom for the first time, has replaced the fat lady and has been making life miserable for the Gryffindors by changing the passwords to the common room all the time, as well as challenging a number of people to duels. Sir Cadogan, yeah. It's Sir Cadogan, what can we say? Professor McGonagall pulls Harry aside to tell him exactly why Sirius Black has escaped Azkaban, until Harry cuts her off and explains that he had overheard that conversation between Molly and Arthur the night before they returned to Hogwarts. She also informs Harry, because of that it isn't a good idea for him to be practicing Quidditch, but after some discussion and Professor McGonagall's obsession with Quidditch, she's a bit obsessed. She's almost as bad as Oliver Wood, I would say. She agrees to have Madam Hooch oversee their practices. Meanwhile, and this is going to come up later, so I should mention it, Snape covers one of the Defense Against the Dark Arts lessons and assigns them an essay on werewolves. If you know, you know. Finally, we see the first Quidditch match of the season, Gryffindor versus Hufflepuff. It's traditionally Gryffindor versus Slytherin. However, Draco Malfoy is playing up the fact that he is still injured from Buckbeak's attack, which happened 2 months previous. Because we all know that the first Quidditch match of the season is usually the first Saturday in November after Halloween. And the attack on Draco was literally on their first day of school on September 2nd. So we got 2 full months there, and he's still not healed up. But, you know, that's Draco. Probably because they're playing in one hell of a storm, during which Harry not only sees a big black dog in the stands, just like the one he saw in Magnolia Crescent, he sees the dog just before the Dementors show up, causing Harry to fall off his broom because he fainted again, just like he did on the Hogwarts Express when the Dementor came to inspect their compartment looking for Sirius. Upon waking in the hospital wing, Harry finds out that they lost their first ever match since Harry joined the team, with Ron and Hermione informing Harry that his Nimbus 2000 was carried away by the wind after Harry fell off of it, and it flew directly into the Whomping Willow. Ouch. And that is the end of Harry's Nimbus 2000. We also know now who Harry heard screaming on the Hogwarts Express during that Dementor inspection back on the Hogwarts Express. Oh, I just said that. His mother screaming and pleading with Voldemort to kill her and not Harry. So, that's kind of where we leave the chapter. this obviously made me think of my PTSD, and I don't necessarily want to dive too deeply into that and what it's like to live with, because there are going to be plenty of opportunities for me to do that when we get to Order of the Phoenix. If you know, you know. However, we do need to discuss it on some level. So we're going to talk about triggers and being triggered and what that can do. We are going to talk about the triggers that can and do occur following the initial trauma event. I should probably not do these so late in the evening, but we're going to roll with it. The reason why I feel like PTSD triggers are a good talking point this week is because that is how triggers often happen in real life. At first, all Harry heard was a woman screaming. He didn't know what it was at the time, and all we heard in response was Ron saying nobody screamed when Harry asked on the Hogwarts Express. However, following the events in the first Quidditch match, he finally knows that he was hearing his mother dying, basically, pleading with Voldemort to not kill Harry, but to kill her, along with Voldemort's cold, harsh laugh and his demands for Lily to stand aside. This is how triggers often happen. It doesn't necessarily register from the outset that we're experiencing a trigger until a few more occurrences happen, which is why we're having this discussion today. So let's walk through a PTSD trigger progression. As we do, I have a past trigger of my own from about a little over a year ago, to share throughout the workflow that I'm about to give you. So we can all see how not all triggers are direct triggers. So the initial exposure has to do, basically, it's a fragmented sensory hit. The first thing that happens is an amygdala hijack. Trauma memory stored non-verbally in the amygdala and limbic system fires first. Raw sensory blasts, such as the screams that Harry heard, any smells, any sense of dread, bypass our prefrontal cortex, which have to do with logic, context. So, here's where it started for me. I was watching a live one evening, not too long before Christmas, when one of the participants in the live, it was like there were multiple people on screen that I could see, and they were talking amongst themselves, like a group Zoom call, basically. And one of the participants was being terrorized by someone that this particular participant, I will just call him participant at this point, had encountered previously, resulting in the participant's own PTSD diagnosis. It is specifically the erratic behavior of the participant that ensued after mentioning the asshole. So the one who terrorized participant, we're going to call him asshole, in the comment section, that signaled to me initially that something was wrong. The next thing that happens is the hippocampus goes offline. You can't timestamp or identify. Going back to Harry, when he asked on the train who screamed, you can't identify anything quite yet. It feels like present danger, not something that's already happened. And the person often dissociates and asks, did that happen? As there's nothing specific in that moment that caused me to question whether the erratic behavior happened or not, this doesn't apply to my particular trigger, so we're going to move on. The result, there's usually this vague sense of terror, but no narrative. The brain in survival scanning mode. not yet processing. So basically, something happened. The brain is now starting to scan, but it's not processing anything yet. So at this point, this is where we see Harry's experience from the Hogwarts Express versus the Quidditch match. From the Hogwarts Express, he's still wondering what happened with no defined narrative yet. And it's the same as my own trigger with that live that I was watching. I had no clue what was happening beyond what participants said about the asshole terrorizing him from the comment section. So when I went to bed that night, it was mostly, I hope participant is okay. The next thing that happens is subsequent exposures. Now things are, starting to crop up a little bit more. The first being state-dependent recall. Repeated triggers recreate original trauma conditions. So stress hormones, the state of our body, we're shifting into fight or flight mode. Pulling deeper layers, specific voices, sequence, emotions, things are starting to crystallize a little bit here. And it was here where I really began noticing the physiological effects on my body. Okay, I awoke after a couple hours sleep that night to find some posts from participant that laid out the full story of the asshole. In short, it was the fear and the pain in participants' eyes in those posts that were most prevalent to me. And given the circumstances that participant was in at the time, I knew that any true help was several hours away. And basically he was isolated, like actually isolated. Okay, he was not home, he was elsewhere. And then we have hippocampus re-engages partially. So we start linking fragments to a source. Basically, that's my memory. But prefrontal cortex still lags. The full, this is the trauma hits later. So things are still starting to crystallize. And this is where I began putting the pieces together for myself here. The participant's trauma event is quite different from mine. So it was the similarities with being isolated that caught my attention. Stick with me. Then we have amygdala sensitization. Each hit amplifies the intensity. Sounds start to sharpen. Emotions are starting to flood as neural pathways strengthen. And here's how this played out for me. So the next morning, after I'd gotten a bit more sleep, after seeing those posts in the middle of the night, basically, I awoke to find that those middle of the night posts had been deleted and that a new post was put up by participant. And basically participant confirmed that it was his own PTSD trigger, and that's when the intensity started cranking up for me. The erratic behavior on the live, following the terrorizing, the pain and the fear in his eyes in those now deleted posts, and knowing that he was isolated, as well as his raw, vulnerable story in the new post, hit me a lot harder than I expected. My emotions are now flooding, in this step, and my neural pathways are lighting up. Participant is no longer just a sad stranger in my trigger. My body now knows the pain of isolation. I've known the pain of isolation for a long time, but it was seeing participants' pain of being isolated. At the time, I'd been so socially isolated that I only had my mom, my son, and my brother, and that's still the case. none of whom ever gave me the emotional support I needed after my trauma event, at least not in the way that I needed it. So now things are starting to click into place. Then you have the recognition threshold. This is naming the trigger. Prefrontal cortex integration. So after about 2 to 5 exposures, and this varies by person, executive functioning starts to catch up and labeling it. For example, this is PTSD, this is my PTSD, not what's happening right now, if that makes sense. And this insight reduces some of the power of the trigger. So here's where it clicked for me. I ultimately had 3 exposures. I had the original live and the erratic behavior that I saw. I had those, it was roughly 4 a.m., so I'll call them those 4 a.m. posts. And then that morning confirmation from the new post that participant had put up. My prefrontal cortex was finally online, basically saying that this isn't just participant's story. I was essentially reliving the pain of my own isolation and abandonment that I felt with my own trauma event. And what added to this was the fact that participant doesn't know who I am. And so I could not contact participant directly and provide any emotional support for him that I wish I had had for myself from my family. So I had no outlet to help another person whose pain I recognized. Thus, this is how I was triggered in steps. Window of tolerance factor only happens in regulated states. So recognition that this was a trigger for me finally landed the following morning. I'd actually listened to participants' follow-up post explaining what had happened on my walk the next morning. And I definitely needed the regulation myself. And this helped me see that I had, in fact, been triggered myself, as well as the how and the why. But doing so in a safer environment for me actually decreased the ultimate effect and the ultimate dread, I would say, that I carried, knowing that, okay, here's a person who has been triggered. PTSD, I understand this. Isolation, I definitely understand that. I could not help. You see how it progressed. And figuring all that out and knowing all this and kind of keeping an eye on things on subsequent posts by participant throughout the rest of the week is what it said here. A window of tolerance factor. You know, the trigger wasn't as strong as it was, I would say, at 4 a.m., with those posts. Anyway, here's the thing about PTSD triggers, however. Some of them don't creep up on you like that one from that live. Sometimes they crash land hard. And it was through processing that and understanding that not only had participant been triggered, and he recognized that in himself, I had been triggered because I understood the pain of isolation, and I don't know this person, so there was no way for me to make direct contact to help, whether it was just to talk, whether it was to share my story, anything like that. But what it also showed me is that I had actually been triggered previously and didn't recognize it as a trigger at the time because I didn't even know I was dealing with PTSD at the time. Follow with me. I had actually reconnected from a friend of mine from high school. This was the end of 2018 sometime. And one day, he and I had been texting. He was out running errands, and he didn't contact me for 10 hours because he said he had fallen asleep and ended up having quite a nap. That brief reconnection didn't last very long, for a number of reasons, and it doesn't matter why. But it wasn't until sitting down and writing this episode and doing my research for it that I realized, oh, yeah, he probably just left me on red, basically. He didn't fall asleep and take a nap and sleep his day away. He left me on red. But whatever. That particular trigger was a full reliving of the original trauma for me. And this is not something that I often discuss when talking about my trauma event, which was the death of the man that I was dating at the time. The missing part is the fact that there was a full 3-day silence between our final text messages that Saturday night and then getting the call from his sister that Tuesday to tell me that he had died, aka my trauma event. During that time, there was one hell of an emotional roller coaster for me. 3 full days, almost literally to the minute. It was right around 9 p.m. that Saturday when I had last heard from him. And it was about 9 p.m. that Tuesday when his sister called me to tell me he had died. 3 full days with this emotional roller coaster. First, I had fear that something bad had happened to him, but I also had a lot of anger that I had done something to upset him, but he was taking the immature route instead of just talking to me about it, and that he was just ghosting me. So you can imagine that after, let's go back to 2018 with the friend I reconnected with in that missing day, we'll call it. So you can imagine that after 10 hours of silence from the first safe friend that I had post-trauma event, boom, right back to the night David's sister called me to tell me he died. So basically, right back to the original trauma event. And I was quite shocked at the time at how quickly I had gotten back mentally to the original trauma event in my mind. You know, the shaking, the tears, the heavy sobs, the constant, please, not again. I can't do this again. You know, screaming it to the universe. I was in a state, and it happened so quickly. I mean, it was a number of hours, 4-5 hours maybe, that I existed in that state. So 10 hours total from when I last heard from my friend and he got home and took his 10-hour nap, and he's calling or texting or whatever it was, like 11:30 at night. So there was like a 10-hour gap. And in 10 hours, I went from okay to full on reliving the original trauma event, and doing so for, I'm going to say, a good 4 hours. You know, about 6:30 when things started getting panicky with me in my mind. And let me tell you, I have said it before, and I will say it again probably until the day I die. PTSD is fucking insidious. It is absolutely fucking insidious. And if you suspect that you are struggling with PTSD yourself, especially after hearing this, please, 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 please do your best to get the proper treatment you need. Enlist the help of somebody who will help you. I had no help. I managed on my own in the first 16 months, from trauma event to losing my job, where a week after losing my job was the 4th and final attempt that I had made to get the help I needed. And not one person said anything about PTSD. Not one person said anything about anything. They just gave me a prescription for something and booted me out the door, basically. My own mother made a snippy comment to me one time. Don't you think this is being a little much, with this exaggerated emotional expression? Again, not knowing it was PTSD. And ever since then, my thought in my head was, okay, you're my mother and you notice something is wrong. Why weren't you grabbing me by the arm, like the moms we see in movies, and making a fuss and demanding by doctors or shrinks or whoever, something is wrong with my daughter, please fucking fix her. She did absolutely nothing except to ask, don't you think you're being a little much? Yeah, that's how I knew something was wrong. I had a personal history at that point with depression, anxiety, and 2 nervous breakdowns. What I was experiencing after David died, in the worst of it for me, was those first 2 years. It wasn't that. In my narrative, every single time I attempted to get help for myself was the same. This thing happened. This is how I've been feeling. And it's not these things, because I already have a history, a mental health history with these things. I need help. And absolutely nobody helped me. Absolutely nobody helped me in that. So when I say to please, please, please find somebody in your corner who will be willing to help, even if they have to call and pretend to be you. Yes, I need to see a shrink. I think I got PTSD, blah, 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 whatever. Do your best to get the help you need, because let me tell you, after everything we talked about in this episode, 13 fucking years of this, I don't like thinking that I'm not the only one, and I know I'm not. PTSD is fucking insidious, so please get the help that you need. Do not let yourself go 13 years with no help, okay? Even though that was through no fault of my own, as I just explained, I've been doing the best I can this entire time to not lose myself in the process, and I absolutely do not recommend it. Okay? The previous chapter, this chapter, the previous chapter, yeah. Sorry, last week's chapter. Part of what Harry and Professor Lupin talk about is what's under the Dementor's hood, and I'm actually now might be confusing when he tells Harry this. He might not have said it yet, but we're going to talk about it anyway, the Dementor's kiss. I did my best to avoid that, and have been doing my best to avoid that on my own with no help for 13 years. Please don't do what you can to get the help you need. So anyway, on that note, ooh, that was a big one. But I felt it was really important, especially when we were talking about, in this chapter, the Dementors and how it affected Harry, and how I imagine Harry must have felt, understanding that now he was hearing his mother's dying moments of, don't kill Harry, kill me. And why he always faints and when a Dementor's around him. So we're going to wrap things up here this week. Next week, we are going to have a lighter discussion because we're going to be talking about Chapter 10, The Marauder's Map. Until then, keep away from the Whomping Willow. Just keep away from the Whomping Willow. How many times do I need to tell you that? Anyway, yeah, I'll see you guys next week. Again, sorry for how deep this one got, but it's important to understand these things, especially if you suspect you've been dealing with this yourself. So, I'll see you next week.